764 workers dead in a single tunnel project. This is how America's deadliest construction disaster was allowed to happen at Hawk's Nest. Tonight we journey back to one of the darkest chapters in American industrial history. A story buried beneath mountains of corporate lies, hidden in unmarked graves, and silenced by the indifference of those who valued profit over human life. This is the story of Hawk's Nest Tunnel, where men went underground seeking honest work and found only suffocation, betrayal, and death. Before we begin, take a moment to settle in. Whether you're watching from the United States, perhaps late in the evening, or from Europe where a morning light might be breaking, or from anywhere else in the world, no matter the time, this story will unfold slowly, deliberately, like the dust that filled those tunnel walls nearly a century ago. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe if you value these historical journeys into forgotten tragedies, and share a comment. Maybe tell us where you're watching from and whether you've ever heard of Hawk's Nest before tonight. Now prepare yourself. Dim the lights, get comfortable, and let your mind travel back to the early 1930s, to the mountains of West Virginia, where desperate men walked willingly into a tomb of stone and dust, believing they were building a future. Instead, they were breathing death with every lungful of air. The year was 1930, and America was drowning in the depths of the Great Depression. Banks had collapsed like houses of cards. Factories stood silent, their machinery rusting. Bread lines stretched around city blocks, and families huddled in shanty towns they called Hoovervilles, named bitterly after the president who seemed powerless to stop the nation's economic freefall. In the rural South, conditions were even more desperate. Black families who had worked as sharecroppers found themselves with nothing. White laborers who had once held steady jobs in mines or mills now wandered from town to town, searching for any work that might feed their children. Hunger was not an abstract concept. It was the gnawing companion that followed men to sleep each night and greeted them each morning. Against this backdrop of national suffering, word began to spread through the hollows and valleys of West Virginia, through the poorest communities of Virginia and North Carolina, through the desperate corners of the South where men would do anything for wages. There was work to be had. Hard work, yes, but paying work. Union Carbide and Carbon Corporation, one of America's industrial giants, was funding a massive hydroelectric project in the mountains of Fayette County, West Virginia. The project was ambitious, visionary even. A tunnel would be drilled through Gauley Mountain, a 3-mile passage through solid rock that would divert the New River and create a 162-foot drop. The falling water would generate electricity for Union Carbide's ferroalloy plant in Alloy, West Virginia. The tunnel would be called Hawk's Nest, named for the hawks that nested in the cliffs above the river. For the men who heard about this project, the details of electricity generation and corporate profits meant little. What mattered was simple and immediate. There were jobs, there were wages. There was a chance to feed families who had known too many hungry nights, and so they came. They came on foot, walking dusty roads with their belongings in cotton sacks. They came by rail, riding in boxcars, clinging to hope as tightly as they clung to the freight trains that carried them north. They came from farms where the soil had turned to dust, from towns where every business had shuttered, from lives that had offered them nothing but the slow starvation of poverty. Most of these men were black. They came from the segregated South where opportunities were always scarce and had now become nearly non-existent. They had heard that this project needed workers, hundreds of workers, and that the companies doing the hiring were not being particular about who they employed. In the desperate calculus of the Depression, this was enough. White workers came too, poor men from the Appalachian hills, coal miners whose mines had closed, laborers whose families had lived in these mountains for generations. The Depression had erased many of the usual barriers. When there was work and men were starving, companies hired whoever would swing a pick or operate a drill for the lowest wage. The site itself was remote, nestled deep in the rugged beauty of the Appalachian Mountains. The New River carved its path through ancient stone, and the forest rose thick and green on either side. In spring, the mountains exploded with dogwood blossoms and rhododendron. In fall, the leaves turned to flame. It was a landscape of profound natural beauty, the kind of place that might inspire poets or painters. But the men who arrived at Hawk's Nest in 1930 and 1931 were not there to admire the scenery. They were there to tear through a mountain, to drill and blast and haul away tons of rock, to create a passage where none had existed before. They were there to survive. The companies running the project were Reinhardt and Dennis Company, the primary contractor, working in partnership with Union Carbide. These were not small operations. Union Carbide was a giant of American industry, producing chemicals, metals, and industrial materials. They had resources, expertise, and a reputation to maintain. The men arriving at Hawk's Nest had none of these things. They had only their labor, their strength, and their desperate need for wages. It was not a negotiation between equals. It never had been, and it never would be. Work on the Hawk's Nest Tunnel officially began in March 1930. The plan was straightforward in concept, but brutal in execution. A tunnel 3 miles long and 32 feet in diameter would be drilled through Gauley Mountain. The rock would be blasted away in sections, and the debris hauled out by the ton. The method was called drill and blast. Teams of workers would use compressed air drills to bore holes deep into the rock face. These holes would then be packed with explosives and detonated, shattering the stone into manageable pieces that could be loaded onto carts and removed from the tunnel. This was standard practice in tunnel construction and mining operations across the country. It was hard, dangerous work under the best of circumstances. Men could be crushed by falling rock, injured by premature explosions, or maimed by equipment failures. Everyone understood these risks. They were part of the job, part of the price you paid for wages. But Hawk's Nest was different. Hawk's Nest was not like other tunnels, and the men who walked into that mountain were walking into something far more deadly than falling rocks or faulty explosives. The difference lay in the rock itself. Gauley Mountain was composed primarily of sandstone, but this was not ordinary sandstone. Geological surveys would later reveal that the rock through which the tunnel was being drilled contained approximately 99% pure silica, nearly pure quartz. It was among the highest concentrations of crystalline silica ever encountered in a construction project. To understand why this mattered, you need to understand what happens when silica is disturbed. When rock containing silica is drilled, blasted, or broken, it releases fine particles of crystalline silica dust into the air. These particles are microscopic, far smaller than grains of sand, invisible to the naked eye. They hang in the air like a suspended fog, and they are light enough to remain airborne for hours. When a person breathes in silica dust, the particles travel deep into the lungs. Unlike larger particles that can be coughed up or filtered by the body's natural defenses, silica particles are small enough to penetrate into the deepest recesses of the lungs, into the tiny air sacs called alveoli, where oxygen enters the bloodstream. Once lodged in the lungs, silica particles trigger inflammation. The body recognizes these particles as foreign invaders and sends immune cells to attack them. But silica cannot be broken down or expelled. The immune response creates scar tissue, fibrous material that gradually replaces healthy lung tissue. This scarring is called silicosis. As silicosis progresses, the lungs lose their ability to function. Breathing becomes difficult, then painful, then nearly impossible. The scarred tissue cannot absorb oxygen efficiently. Victims experience constant shortness of breath, severe coughing, chest pain, and eventually respiratory failure. There is no cure. Once the damage is done, it is permanent and progressive. In 1930, silicosis was already a well-known occupational disease. Doctors and industrial hygienists understood the dangers of silica dust. Mining companies had dealt with silicosis cases for decades. The disease had been studied, documented, and described in medical journals. The hazards were not a mystery, and yet at Hawk's Nest, no one told the workers they were drilling through nearly pure silica. No one explained that every breath they took inside that tunnel was filling their lungs with particles that would kill them. No one provided the protective equipment that might have saved their lives. The work began in earnest. Crews were divided into shifts that worked around the clock. The tunnel advanced deeper into the mountain, foot by foot, blast by blast. The compressed air drills screamed against stone, creating a deafening roar that echoed through the confined space. When the explosives detonated, the concussion shook the mountain and sent clouds of pulverized rock billowing through the tunnel. Inside, the air became thick with dust. Not the heavy dust of dirt roads or coal mines, but a fine, almost invisible mist that coated everything and everyone. It settled on skin, on clothing, on tools and equipment, and with every breath, workers drew it into their lungs. The companies prioritized speed above all else. Union Carbide needed the hydroelectric plant operational as quickly as possible. Reinhardt and Dennis Company had financial incentives to complete the project ahead of schedule. Time was money, and money was everything. So the drilling continued at a relentless pace. Shifts were long, sometimes 10 or 12 hours. The work was exhausting, the conditions brutal. Men labored in near darkness, lit only by electric lamps that cast harsh shadows on the tunnel walls. The compressed air drills vibrated so violently that they numbed workers' hands and arms. The heat from the rock, compressed air, and packed bodies made the tunnel oppressively hot despite the mountain's cool exterior. And always, always, there was the dust. It filled the air so thickly that men could barely see their hands in front of their faces immediately after a blast. It coated their throats, their noses, their eyes. They breathed it, ate it with their meager meals, coughed it up in thick, gritty phlegm. Some workers began to notice problems within the first few weeks. A persistent cough that would not go away. Shortness of breath that worsened with each passing day. A tightness in the chest that made deep breathing painful. They mentioned these symptoms to each other during breaks, comparing notes, wondering if the tunnel was making them sick. The foreman told them it was nothing. Just the adjustment to hard work, to the confined space, to the mountain air. Keep working. Keep drilling. The job must go on. And so they did. Because what choice did they have? There were no other jobs. Their families were hungry. The alternative to working in the tunnel was returning home to nothing, to starvation, to watching children go without food. So they ignored the cough, pushed through the breathlessness, and went back underground. To truly comprehend what was happening inside Hawk's Nest Tunnel, we must pause and understand the nature of the invisible killers that filled its air. Crystalline silica is one of the most abundant minerals on Earth. It exists in sand, stone, concrete, brick, and many other common materials. In most circumstances, it poses no threat. Solid rock containing silica is harmless. Beach sand, though composed largely of silica, is too coarse to be easily inhaled. The danger emerges when silica is broken down into respirable particles. These are particles measuring less than 10 micrometers in diameter, small enough to bypass the body's natural defenses and penetrate deep into lung tissue. At this microscopic scale, silica becomes a deadly respiratory hazard. The process of drilling, blasting, and crushing rock creates enormous quantities of respirable silica dust. Each impact of a drill bit against silica-rich stone releases clouds of microscopic particles. Each explosion shatters rock into powder. Each cartload of debris hauled through the tunnel stirs up settled dust, sending it back into the air where workers breathe it again and again. At Hawk's Nest, the concentration of silica in the rock was extraordinarily high. Later analysis would show readings of 97 to 99% pure silica in the sandstone. This was not typical. Most sandstone contains far lower percentages. But geological chance had created in Gauley Mountain an almost pure deposit of the very mineral most dangerous to human lungs. The dust generated by drilling through this rock was therefore almost entirely composed of crystalline silica. Every breath taken inside that tunnel after a blast or during drilling operations meant inhaling thousands, perhaps millions, of microscopic silica particles. The body's response to silica inhalation follows a predictable and tragic pattern. When silica particles reach the alveoli, the tiny air sacs where oxygen transfer occurs, they are immediately recognized as foreign material. Macrophages, large immune cells, whose job is to consume and destroy invaders, engulf the silica particles. But here the normal protective mechanism fails catastrophically. Silica is chemically inert and physically indestructible at body temperature. The macrophages cannot digest or eliminate it. Instead, the silica particles damage the macrophages from within, causing them to release inflammatory chemicals as they die. This inflammation triggers the formation of scar tissue, technically called fibrosis. The delicate, elastic alveolar tissue, which must remain thin and flexible to allow oxygen to pass into the bloodstream, is gradually replaced by thick, rigid scar tissue. This process is irreversible. Once formed, the scars remain permanently. As more and more lung tissue becomes scarred, the lungs lose their capacity to function. The scarring reduces the surface area available for gas exchange. The rigid fibrotic tissue cannot expand and contract properly, making breathing mechanically difficult. Victims must work harder and harder just to draw breath, even at rest. The disease progresses through stages. In acute silicosis, which can develop after only months of intense exposure, the lungs become so inflamed and scarred that victims essentially suffocate over a period of weeks or months. In chronic silicosis, which typically develops after years of exposure, the progression is slower but equally deadly. Victims experience increasing disability, becoming unable to work, then unable to walk more than a few steps, and finally unable to breathe even while lying still. Silicosis also increases susceptibility to other lung diseases. The scarred, inflamed tissue is more vulnerable to tuberculosis infection. The combination of silicosis and tuberculosis, sometimes called silicotuberculosis, is particularly lethal. The immune system, already compromised by the silica-induced inflammation, cannot effectively fight the bacterial infection. By 1930, all of this was known. Medical journals had published extensively on silicosis. Industrial hygienists had measured dust levels in mines and factories. Compensation cases had been fought in courts. The dangers of silica dust were not mysterious or newly discovered. They were established medical fact, and yet at Hawk's Nest this knowledge was deliberately ignored. The workers drilling through 99% pure silica were told nothing. They were given no training on the hazards they faced. They were provided no protective equipment. They were, in effect, sentenced to death by the very companies they believed had offered them salvation through employment. The men who worked in a Hawk's Nest tunnel came from everywhere and nowhere. They were the displaced, the desperate, the forgotten. In the Jim Crow South of 1930, they were also largely black, consigned by segregation and economic discrimination to the hardest, most dangerous, and lowest paid work available. Many had been sharecroppers, farming land they did not own, perpetually in debt to landlords who controlled the credit system. When cotton prices collapsed during the Depression, these families lost even the meager living they had scraped from the soil. The choice became simple: stay and starve, or leave and search for work, anywhere. Others had worked in coal mines in Alabama, Tennessee, or West Virginia itself. But mines were closing or running with skeleton crews. Coal operators slashed wages and eliminated jobs. Mining had always been dangerous, but it had provided steady work for those willing to risk their lives underground. Now even that brutal bargain was unavailable. They came to Hawk's Nest because word had spread that contractors were hiring. You did not need special skills. You did not need to read or write. You just needed a strong back and a willingness to work. For men who had been turned away from job after job, who had watched their children go hungry night after night, this was enough. The pay was poor, even by Depression standards. Most workers earned between $2 and $3 per day, paid in scrip rather than cash. Scrip was company-issued currency that could only be spent at company stores. This ensured that even the meager wages paid to workers flowed back into company coffers through inflated prices on food, clothing, and supplies. Housing was provided, if it could be called that. Workers lived in crude camps near the tunnel entrance, sleeping in overcrowded barracks or tents. Conditions were unsanitary. Clean water was scarce. Medical care was non-existent unless you counted the company doctor, whose primary function seemed to be declaring sick workers fit for continued labor. Food was inadequate, both in quantity and quality. Men working 10 or 12-hour shifts of hard physical labor need substantial calories, protein, and nutrition. Instead, they receive beans, cornbread, and occasionally fatty pork, purchased at inflated prices from the company store. Many workers lost weight rapidly despite the heavy labor. Their bodies consumed themselves, burning muscle to fuel the exhausting work. Despite these conditions, the workers persevered. They sent money home to families, even though there was little to send. They endured the hardship because the alternative, returning home empty-handed to face starvation, was worse. They formed communities within the camps, supporting each other, sharing what little they had, and maintaining their dignity in circumstances designed to strip it away. Among these workers were fathers trying to feed children, husbands trying to support wives, and sons trying to help aging parents. There were young men barely out of adolescence and older men who should have been past heavy labor. There were experienced miners who knew the dangers of underground work, and farm laborers who had never before been inside a tunnel. What united them was not their backgrounds, but their circumstances. They were poor. They were desperate. And they were considered expendable by the companies that employed them. The racial dynamics of Hawk's Nest reflected the broader racism of the era. Black workers were consistently assigned to the most dangerous positions. They worked at the tunnel face where dust concentrations were highest. They operated the drills that released the greatest quantities of silica particles. They were the first into areas after blasts when the air was still thick with suspended dust. White workers, though also exposed to dangerous conditions, were more often assigned to operate equipment outside the tunnel, to drive trucks, or to supervise. They still faced silica exposure, and many would die as a result. But the deliberate placement of black workers in the most hazardous positions reflected a racist calculation that their lives mattered less, that their deaths would provoke less outcry, and that their families would have fewer resources to seek justice or compensation. This was not accidental, it was policy, encoded in the informal but rigid hierarchy of the worksite. Black workers understood this. They had lived under segregation their entire lives. They knew that their humanity was denied, their labor exploited, and their lives devalued. Hawk's Nest was simply another expression of the same system that had oppressed them since birth. And yet they worked. They laughed together during breaks. They sang work songs to maintain rhythm while drilling. They looked out for each other, warning of dangers, sharing water, and helping those who stumbled or fell. They maintained their humanity in a system designed to reduce them to mere units of labor. These were the men of Hawk's Nest, fathers and husbands and sons, human beings with hopes and dreams and families. They deserved safety. They deserved truth. They deserved life. They received none of these things. Within months of the tunnel work beginning, men started to die. Not occasionally, not as isolated incidents, but in numbers that should have stopped the project immediately. Workers who had arrived at Hawk's Nest healthy and strong began to weaken visibly. The cough that had seemed like a minor annoyance grew worse, more persistent, more violent. Men coughed until they vomited. They coughed until blood flecked their lips. They coughed until their ribs ached from the constant convulsions. Breathing became an ordeal. Men who had swung heavy hammers and operated powerful drills now struggled to walk from their barracks to the work site. They gasped for air after climbing a small hill. They woke at night choking, unable to draw a full breath, panicking as their lungs refused to function. The symptoms were consistent and unmistakable to anyone with medical knowledge. These men were suffering from acute silicosis, the rapid onset form of the disease that strikes after intense exposure to high concentrations of respirable silica dust. Their lungs were being destroyed, not over years or decades, but over months. Some men realized they were dying. They understood, perhaps without knowing the medical terminology, that something in the tunnel was killing them. They tried to leave, to quit the job and return home while they still had the strength to travel. But many had no money for the journey. The scrip they earned was worthless outside the company system. They were trapped, too sick to work effectively, but unable to leave. Others collapsed on the job. They would be drilling or hauling rock when their lungs simply gave out. They fell where they stood, gasping like landed fish, their lips turning blue from oxygen starvation. Sometimes co-workers carried them to the surface. Sometimes they died in the tunnel, their bodies removed like another piece of debris to be cleared from the work site. The company doctor, Dr. R. Sayers, examined some of the sick workers. His diagnoses were creative and varied: pneumonia, tuberculosis, bronchitis, heart failure. Sometimes he simply wrote tunnelitis on the medical forms, a made-up term that explained nothing and hid everything. He rarely, if ever, wrote silicosis, though that was the obvious and correct diagnosis. This was not medical ignorance. Dr. Sayers knew exactly what was happening. Any physician examining workers with these symptoms, who had been drilling through silica-rich rock in conditions of poor ventilation, would immediately suspect silicosis. But acknowledging silicosis meant acknowledging company negligence. It meant compensation claims. It meant investigations. It meant the project might be shut down. So the company doctor wrote other diagnoses. When workers became too sick to work, he declared them unemployable and had them removed from the site. Some were literally put on trains and shipped back to their home states, still sick, still dying, but no longer the company's problem. This practice served multiple purposes. It removed dying workers from the immediate area, making the death toll at the site appear lower. It ensured that when workers died, they died elsewhere, in different counties and states, scattering the deaths across a wide geographic area where they were less likely to be connected to a single cause, and it absolved the company of any responsibility to provide medical care or death benefits. Families received telegrams or letters informing them that their husband, father, or son was being sent home due to illness. The sick workers arrived on trains so weak they could barely walk, coughing and gasping. Many died within days or weeks of arriving home. Their families, poor and powerless, buried them in local cemeteries or in unmarked graves on family land. The death certificates filled out by local doctors in these far-flung locations listed pneumonia, tuberculosis, or heart failure. They had no reason to suspect industrial disease. They were not informed that the deceased had been working in conditions of extreme silica exposure. The paper trail was deliberately obscured. Meanwhile, back at Hawk's Nest, workers who died on site or in the camps were buried quickly and quietly. Some were interred in a field near the tunnel entrance, in graves marked only by wooden crosses that rotted away within a few years. One survivor would later testify that bodies were buried in shifts during work hours when the other crews were underground and could not witness what was happening. Black workers were buried in segregated sections, separated in death, as they had been in life. Their graves were even more hastily prepared, less carefully marked. Some were simply buried where convenient, their final resting places lost to time. The numbers were staggering. By the end of 1930, dozens of workers had died. By mid-1931, the count was in the hundreds. But there was no central record, no official tally. The company kept minimal documentation. Local authorities, such as they were in rural Fayette County, did not investigate. The deaths were treated as individual incidents, separate and unrelated, rather than as symptoms of a systematic industrial disaster. For the workers who remained, the pattern was clear and terrifying. They saw healthy men sicken and die within months. They knew with the certainty of lived experience that the tunnel was killing them, but they had no power to change conditions. They could not demand ventilation systems or respirators. They could not insist on safety measures or reduced exposure. Their only choice was to keep working and hope they would be among the survivors, or to leave and face starvation. Most stayed. What else could they do? The question that haunts Hawk's Nest is not whether silica dust is dangerous. That was established medical fact decades before the tunnel was drilled. The question is what the companies knew, when they knew it, and what they chose to do with that knowledge. The evidence is damning and clear. Union Carbide and Reinhardt and Dennis Company knew they were drilling through rock with exceptionally high silica content. Geological surveys conducted before construction began would have revealed this. Any competent engineer assessing the site would have recognized the implications for worker safety. Industrial hygiene standards of the era, while less stringent than modern regulations, nonetheless called for specific precautions when working with silica. Ventilation systems to clear dust from work areas, water sprays to suppress dust during drilling, respirators for workers in high dust environments, regular medical examinations to detect early signs of silicosis. None of these measures were implemented at Hawk's Nest. The tunnel was drilled using dry drilling methods, which generate maximum dust. No ventilation fans were installed to clear the air. No water was used to suppress dust during drilling operations. Workers were provided no respirators, not even simple cloth masks that might have offered marginal protection. This was not oversight or ignorance. It was deliberate cost-cutting. Ventilation systems and water sprays would have slowed the work and added expense. Respirators cost money. Medical examinations would have revealed the epidemic of silicosis, potentially leading to compensation claims or legal liability. The companies made a calculated decision. It was cheaper to let workers die than to implement safety measures. The workers were poor, mostly black, and politically powerless. Their deaths would provoke no outcry. Their families had no resources to sue. The profit from completing the projects ahead of schedule far outweighed any potential legal or moral costs. Contemporary documents support this conclusion. Internal memos and correspondence that would later surface during congressional hearings showed that company officials discussed the silica content of the rock and the potential for dust-related illness. They knew, and they proceeded anyway. One particularly chilling piece of evidence emerged from company records. Reinhardt and Dennis Company took out life insurance policies on many of the workers, with the company named as beneficiary. When workers died, the company collected the insurance payouts. They quite literally profited from the deaths they had caused. This practice was legal at the time, though morally abhorrent. It reveals the cold calculation behind company decisions. Workers were not human beings to be protected. They were assets to be exploited, and even their deaths could be monetized. The companies also moved quickly to control information and limit liability. They hired lawyers to monitor news reports. They pressured local officials to avoid publicity. They paid some families small settlements in exchange for signing releases that waived any future legal claims. These settlements were often insultingly small, sometimes as little as $30 for a man's life. Black families received systematically lower settlement offers than white families. This racial disparity in compensation reflected the same racist devaluation that had placed black workers in the most dangerous positions in the first place. Even in death, they were treated as less than fully human. The companies also worked to prevent surviving workers from speaking out. Some workers were threatened with blacklisting if they complained publicly. Others were offered small payments in exchange for silence. A few who attempted to organize or protest were fired and evicted from company housing. This deliberate suppression of information allowed the disaster to continue much longer than it otherwise might have. If workers had been able to speak freely, if journalists had investigated early, if public outrage had been aroused in 1930 or 1931, the project might have been halted or modified. Safety measures might have been imposed. Lives might have been saved. Instead, the companies maintained their wall of silence, and the dying continued. Despite the mounting death toll, or perhaps because the companies were desperate to finish before public awareness grew, the work at Hawks Nest Tunnel accelerated through 1931. Crews worked longer shifts. More workers were hired to replace those who had died or become too sick to continue. The drilling pushed forward relentlessly. By late 1931, the tunnel was complete. 3 miles of passage carved through Gauley Mountain, 32 feet in diameter, a remarkable engineering achievement by the standards of the day. The new river was diverted through this new channel, creating the promised drop that would generate hydroelectric power for Union Carbide's operations. The hydroelectric plant began operating in 1932. Water flowing through the tunnel turned massive turbines, generating electricity that powered the ferroalloy production, that was Union Carbide's core business. The company realized its goal. The project was deemed a success, but the cost of that success was written in the bodies buried in unmarked graves, in the men who returned home to die slowly, and in the families left destitute by the loss of their breadwinners. The final death toll would never be precisely known, but estimates eventually reached 764 workers dead from silicosis, directly attributable to their labor at Hawk's Nest. 764 human lives, fathers who would never see their children grow up, husbands who left widows struggling to survive alone, sons who died before their parents. Each one was a person with hopes, dreams, and value. Each death was a tragedy that rippled through families and communities, and yet, for years, no one outside the immediate area knew. The deaths had been scattered and hidden. The company had suppressed information. Local authorities had not investigated. The workers had been too poor and powerless to demand justice. The tunnel stood as a monument to American industrial might, to engineering prowess, to the ability to reshape nature to serve human purposes. But it was also a tomb, built quite literally on the bodies of workers who had been sacrificed for profit. In the years immediately following completion, the disaster remained largely secret. Workers who survived carried the knowledge of what had happened, but they had no platform to speak from. The widows and families knew their loved ones had been killed by their work, but they had no means to publicize their loss. Hawk's Nest might have remained forgotten, just another instance of workers dying for industrial progress, their sacrifice unacknowledged and their stories untold. But slowly, painfully, the truth began to emerge. By the mid-1930s, several years after the tunnel's completion, information about Hawk's Nest began to leak out. Surviving workers, though many were sick and dying themselves, started telling their stories to journalists, lawyers, and anyone who would listen. The dam of silence the companies had built began to crack. One of the first journalists to investigate was a reporter named Philippa Allen, who worked for a labor newspaper. She traveled to West Virginia and spoke with survivors and families. What she heard shocked her. Men described working in dust so thick they could not see. They described coworkers collapsing and dying. They described being given no protection and no warning about the dangers they faced. Allen's articles brought the disaster to wider attention. Other journalists followed, interviewing more workers and documenting the scale of the tragedy. Photographs appeared showing the haunted faces of survivors, men in their 20s and 30s who looked decades older, hollowed out by disease. Widows spoke of watching their husbands suffocate slowly. They described the economic devastation that followed the breadwinner's death. Many had received no compensation whatsoever. Others had been pressured into accepting tiny settlements that barely covered burial costs. One widow, Cecilia Williams, described how her husband had returned from Hawk's Nest already dying. He lasted 3 weeks at home, coughing and gasping, before he finally drowned in the fluids filling his lungs. She was left with 4 children and no income. The company offered her $30. Another survivor, a white worker named Shirley. Dials described the conditions in the tunnel. He said the dust was so thick after blasting that you could write your name on any surface immediately. He said men begged for masks or ventilation and were told to stop complaining or quit. He said he saw men his own age die within months of starting work. These testimonies were powerful and damning. They painted a picture not of industrial accident, but of corporate negligence bordering on murder. The companies had knowingly exposed workers to lethal conditions. They had hidden the evidence. They had profited from the deaths. As more information emerged, lawyers began taking interest. Several attorneys, some working for labor unions or civil rights organizations, began filing lawsuits on behalf of families. These cases faced enormous obstacles. The workers had been poor and transient. Many had signed releases or waivers. Medical documentation was sparse or falsified. But the lawyers persevered, gathering evidence, taking depositions, and building cases. They obtained geological surveys showing the high silica content of the rock. They found medical experts willing to testify that the symptoms described were consistent with acute silicosis. They assembled testimony from dozens of survivors and family members. By 1935, the legal cases had advanced enough to attract attention in Washington. Congresswoman Jennings Randolph of West Virginia, responding to pressure from constituents and labor advocates, called for congressional hearings to investigate the disaster. In January 1936, the House of Representatives Labor Committee convened hearings on Hawk's Nest. For the first time, the full scope of the disaster was officially documented. Survivors testified before Congress. Medical experts explained silicosis and its causes. Engineers described the lack of safety measures. And gradually, undeniably, the truth emerged. The hearings revealed that the companies had been repeatedly warned about the dangers. Engineers had advised that ventilation systems were necessary. Outside consultants had recommended water spraying to suppress dust. All of these recommendations had been ignored. Testimony established that dry drilling, the method used at Hawk's Nest, generated far more respirable dust than wet drilling. Yet the companies continued using dry methods because they were faster and cheaper. Time was money. Lives were not. Medical testimony was particularly damning. Dr. Harless, a physician who had treated many of the workers, described finding lungs so damaged by silica that they had turned rock hard, almost stone-like. He said the men had essentially been buried alive, their lungs filled with the very rock they had been paid to drill. The hearings also exposed the racial dimensions of the disaster. Testimony made clear that black workers had been systematically assigned to the most dangerous positions. They had been paid less, housed in worse conditions, and treated as expendable. When they died, their families received lower compensation, if any at all. The congressional testimony included heart-wrenching statements from widows. One woman described her husband returning home so weak he could not lift his young son. Another spoke of selling everything they owned to try to pay for medical care that could not save him. A third described watching multiple neighbors die within months of each other, all men who had worked at Hawk's Nest together. The human cost, so carefully hidden by the companies, was now part of the official record. Hundreds of pages of congressional testimony documented names, dates, circumstances of death, and family impact. The disaster could no longer be denied or minimized. The hearings also examined the financial arrangements. Testimony revealed the life insurance policies the companies had taken out on workers, with the company as beneficiary. This particularly egregious detail shocked even hardened politicians. The companies had bet on workers dying and had profited when they did. Congressional investigators calculated that Reinhardt and Dennis Company collected approximately $40,000 from these death benefits, a substantial sum in Depression-era dollars. Meanwhile, families received settlements averaging $30 to $50, if anything at all. The racial disparity in settlements was also quantified. White families received average settlements of $50. Black families received average settlements of $30. This was not accidental variation. It was systematic devaluation of black lives. The hearings concluded with strong criticism of both the companies and the regulatory system that had allowed this disaster to occur. Committee members expressed outrage. They called the events at Hawk's Nest a disgrace to American industry. They demanded accountability. But for all the publicity and official condemnation, the actual consequences for the companies were minimal. Following the congressional hearings, a consolidated legal case representing 538 workers and families went to trial in 1936. The lawsuit sought significant damages from Union Carbide and Reinhardt and Dennis Company, arguing that the company's negligence had caused the deaths and injuries. The legal strategy was straightforward. The plaintiffs argued that the companies knew or should have known about the silica hazard. They argued that the failure to provide ventilation, water sprays, or respirators constituted gross negligence. They argued that the companies had deliberately hidden the extent of the disaster and had obstructed workers' ability to seek medical care or compensation. The evidence was substantial. Survivors testified. Medical experts confirmed that silicosis was the cause of death. Engineers explained how simple safety measures could have prevented most of the harm. Family members described the suffering and economic devastation. But the legal system of 1930s West Virginia was not designed to deliver justice to poor workers, especially blacks. Workers against powerful corporations. The companies deployed teams of expensive lawyers. They challenged every claim. They questioned the credibility of witnesses. They argued that workers had assumed the risks of their employment. Most damagingly, the companies pointed to the waivers and releases many families had signed. Even though these documents had been obtained through coercion and deception, even though the families had been desperate and uninformed, the courts treated them as valid legal contracts. In the end, the case was settled out of court for $130,000, to be divided among 538 plaintiffs and their lawyers. After legal fees, most families received approximately $30 to $50. Some received less. Some received nothing because they had signed earlier releases or could not provide adequate documentation of their relationship to deceased workers. For context, $130,000 divided among 538 claimants averages about $240 each before legal fees. This was the value the legal system placed on lives destroyed by corporate negligence. It was an insult added to the injury of death. No criminal charges were filed. No company officials went to jail. No corporate charter was revoked. The companies paid what amounted to a trivial fine, far less than the profits they had gained from completing the tunnel ahead of schedule. Union Carbide continued to operate profitably. Reinhardt and Dennis Company continued to bid on construction projects. The hydroelectric plant continued to generate power from the tunnel built on workers' bodies. From a corporate perspective, the affair had been handled successfully. For the families, however, justice was utterly denied. Widows remained impoverished. Children grew up without fathers. Survivors continued dying from silicosis for years after the case was settled. The $30 they received, if they received anything at all, could not possibly compensate for their loss. The legal outcome also had a chilling effect on other potential cases. Workers in similar situations elsewhere saw that even with compelling evidence and congressional support, justice against corporations was nearly impossible to obtain. The Hawks Nest precedent suggested that workers' lives were essentially worthless in the legal system. This outcome reflected broader systemic issues. The legal system protected property rights and corporate interests far more robustly than it protected workers' lives or rights. Courts were reluctant to impose substantial damages on employers. Juries in company-dominated towns were often sympathetic to corporate defendants, and racism permeated every aspect of the legal proceedings. Black families faced additional barriers in pursuing claims. Their testimony was given less weight. Their suffering was treated as less significant. The racial wage gap extended even to death, benefits, and legal settlements. The Hawks Nest lawsuits demonstrated that even in the most egregious cases of corporate negligence, justice for workers was elusive at best and often entirely unattainable. The Hawk's Nest disaster, despite the failure to achieve legal justice, did contribute to medical and scientific understanding of silicosis. Doctors who treated survivors documented the disease's progression in unprecedented detail. The sheer number of cases concentrated in one place and time provided researchers with data that would shape occupational medicine for decades. Dr. Leroy Gardner, a prominent pathologist, studied lung tissue samples from Hawk's Nest victims. His findings confirmed that the damage was indeed silicosis and that the rapid onset was consistent with exposure to very high concentrations of respirable silica dust. His work helped establish medical standards for diagnosing and understanding the disease. The research emanating from Hawk's Nest also influenced the development of dust control standards. Industrial hygienists used the disaster as a case study in what happens when dust controls are absent. The deaths became data points in arguments for mandatory ventilation, wet drilling methods, and personal protective equipment. By the 1940s, partly as a result of publicity around Hawk's Nest, silicosis was widely recognized as a major occupational hazard. States began passing laws requiring dust control measures in mines and tunnels. Federal agencies developed recommended exposure limits, though enforcement was often weak. The medical profession also developed better diagnostic tools. X-rays could reveal the characteristic patterns of silicosis scarring in lungs. Pulmonary function tests could measure the degree of breathing impairment. These tools allowed earlier detection, though treatment options remained limited. For the survivors of Hawk's Nest, however, medical advances came too late. Those who lived through the initial epidemic faced decades of progressive disability. Silicosis is incurable. Once the scarring begins, it continues. Many survivors found themselves unable to work by their 30s, dependent on family or meager disability payments. The disease also increased their vulnerability to tuberculosis. Many Hawk's Nest survivors developed TB infections that their damaged lungs could not fight off effectively. The combination of silicosis and tuberculosis was often fatal within months. Some survivors lived longer, enduring decades of breathlessness and limitation. They could not run, could not climb stairs, could not laugh too hard without triggering painful coughing fits. Their lives were measured out in careful breaths, rationing their limited lung function to accomplish basic daily tasks. For families, watching a loved one slowly suffocate over years was agonizing. There was no treatment that could reverse the damage. Oxygen supplementation could provide some relief, but it was expensive and not widely available until much later. The best doctors could offer was palliative care, managing symptoms, and trying to maintain quality of life. The psychological toll on survivors was also profound. They knew they were dying. They watched friends and coworkers die. They understood that their condition was preventable, that their suffering was the direct result of corporate decisions to prioritize profit over safety. Many experienced profound bitterness and anger, yet their voices continued to be marginalized. When survivors spoke of their experiences, they were often dismissed as exaggerating or seeking sympathy. The medical establishment sometimes questioned their accounts, suggesting that their symptoms were psychosomatic or that they had pre-existing conditions. This disbelief and dismissal added insult to injury. The men who had survived Hawk's Nest had endured the tunnel's dust, the company's lies, and the legal system's failure. Now they faced skepticism about their own suffering. Only gradually, as more medical evidence accumulated and as occupational health became more established as a field, did survivors find their experiences validated. By then, many had already died. For decades after the lawsuit settled, Hawk's Nest Tunnel faded from public consciousness. It was not taught in schools. It was not commemorated with monuments. The workers who had died were not honored or remembered publicly. The disaster became a ghost story, whispered in Appalachian communities, but largely unknown outside the region. This forgetting was not accidental. It served corporate and political interests to let Hawk's Nest fade from memory. The disaster was an embarrassment, a stark example of industrial capitalism's brutality. Allowing it to be remembered meant confronting uncomfortable truths about whose lives mattered and whose deaths were acceptable. The racial dimensions of the disaster also contributed to its erasure. Most of the victims were black, and in the segregated South, and in a nation that systemically devalued black lives, their deaths simply did not register as nationally significant. White workers died too, but they were also poor and disposable in the eyes of power. Some families kept the memory alive. They told stories to children and grandchildren. They maintained makeshift graves. They gathered occasionally to remember their lost loved ones. But this was private memory, localized and limited in impact. In the 1960s and 1970s, as labor movements gained strength and civil rights activism highlighted systemic injustices, some historians and activists began revisiting Hawk's Nest. They saw it as a case study in corporate abuse and racial oppression. Books and articles were published bringing the disaster to a new generation's attention. Poet Muriel Rukeyser wrote a long poem titled The Book of the Dead in 1938, documenting the disaster through verse. Her work combined documentary research with poetic language, creating a powerful artistic memorial. Though not widely read at the time, the poem was rediscovered by later generations and became an important cultural artifact. Labor historians incorporated Hawk's Nest into broader narratives about workplace safety and workers' rights. The disaster became a touchstone in arguments for stronger regulations and enforcement. It demonstrated clearly the need for government intervention to protect workers from corporate negligence. Environmental justice scholars also found relevance in Hawk's Nest. It was an early example of how environmental and occupational hazards disproportionately affect poor communities and communities of color. The pattern of placing the most dangerous conditions on the most vulnerable workers presaged countless later environmental justice struggles. Yet despite this scholarly and activist attention, Hawk's Nest remained largely absent from mainstream American memory. It was not included in most history textbooks. There was no national memorial. The tunnel itself continued to operate, generating power with no visible acknowledgement of the blood that had been shed in its construction. This absence from official memory reflected broader patterns of what gets remembered and commemorated in American history. Industrial disasters that killed workers, especially poor and black workers, were deemed less significant than wars, political events, or the achievements of great men. The worker suffering was not seen as historically important. It was not until 2015, 85 years after the tunnel was built, that the first official memorial to the Hawk's Nest victims was erected. The memorial, located at an overlook near the tunnel site, consists of a simple stone marker listing some of the names of workers who died. The memorial was the result of years of advocacy by local activists, descendants of victims, and labor historians. They raised funds, lobbied local authorities, and worked to identify as many victims as possible. The names carved on the memorial represent a fraction of those who died, limited by the poor documentation and scattered records. The dedication ceremony was emotional. Descendants of victims, some traveling from across the country, gathered to finally see their ancestors acknowledged. Elderly survivors, if any remained, could witness this long overdue recognition. Speakers emphasized the importance of remembering and learning from this tragedy. Yet the memorial also highlighted the inadequacy of the response. 85 years is a long time to wait for acknowledgement. Most families who suffered had never lived to see their loss officially recognized. The memorial could not bring justice or compensation. It could only offer symbolic recognition. The names carved in stone are also incomplete. Despite the researchers' best efforts, hundreds of victims could not be identified. Poor record keeping, the passage of time, and the company's deliberate obfuscation meant that many workers who died at Hawk's Nest remain forever anonymous. This anonymity is itself a form of continued injustice. These men lived, worked, and died. They had names and families and stories, but they have been erased from history as thoroughly as if they never existed. The memorial can honor those whose names are known, but it cannot fully restore what was taken from those who remain unnamed. The memorial also raises questions about what remembrance means. Is a stone marker enough? Does it constitute justice or merely an aesthetic gesture? What obligations does remembrance create? If we remember Hawk's Nest, what changes does that memory demand? Some argue that true memorialization would require more than a monument. It would require educational programs ensuring that every American learns this history. It would require systematic efforts to prevent similar disasters in contemporary workplaces. It would require ongoing compensation to descendants and communities still affected by the deaths of breadwinners 90 years ago. Others contend that the memorial, however delayed and incomplete, represents an important step. It breaks the silence. It insists that these lives mattered. It creates a physical place where people can come to remember and reflect. Both perspectives have merit. The memorial is both insufficient and important. It cannot undo the past, but it can shape how we understand that past and what we do with that understanding going forward. Lessons and legacy. What Hawk's Nest teaches us. The Hawk's Nest disaster offers lessons that remain relevant nearly a century later. It demonstrates the deadly consequences of prioritizing profit over worker safety. It shows how corporate power can obstruct justice and accountability. It reveals the racist structures that make some lives expendable while protecting others. The most fundamental lesson is that workplace safety requires vigilance and enforcement. Companies, absent regulation and oversight, will often choose the cheapest and fastest methods regardless of worker risk. This is not inevitable human nature. It is the logic of capitalism, where costs are minimized and externalized whenever possible. Workers' lives are treated as just another cost to be reduced. Regulation alone is insufficient, as Hawk's Nest demonstrated. Even in the 1930s, there were industrial hygiene recommendations about silica dust. The problem was not lack of knowledge, but lack of enforcement and accountability. Companies ignored best practices because there were no meaningful consequences for doing so. This pattern repeats throughout American industrial history. From Triangle Shirtwaist to BP Texas City, from coal mine disasters to chemical plant explosions, workers die when companies cut corners and regulators fail to enforce safety standards. Hawk's Nest is not an isolated incident. It is an example of systemic problems that persist. The racial dimensions of Hawk's Nest also offer crucial lessons. The deliberate placement of black workers in the most dangerous positions reflected deeply embedded racism that valued white lives over black lives. This was not incidental, but central to how the disasters unfolded. Contemporary workplace safety data shows that this pattern continues. Workers of color, immigrant workers, and others marginalized by race and class face higher rates of workplace injury and death. They are disproportionately employed in dangerous industries with poor safety records. Their complaints are taken less seriously. Their deaths receive less attention. Hawk's Nest teaches us that workplace safety and racial justice are inseparable. Any effort to protect workers must confront and dismantle the racist structures that make some workers more vulnerable than others. The disaster also illuminates the limits of legal systems in delivering justice to workers. The Hawk's Nest lawsuits demonstrated that even with overwhelming evidence of negligence, poor workers face enormous obstacles in seeking accountability. Legal representation is expensive. Discovery is lengthy. Companies have resources to delay and obstruct, and even victories often yield minimal compensation. Workers seeking justice cannot rely solely on courts. They need collective power through unions, political representation, public pressure, and regulatory enforcement. The law, while important, is only one tool, and often an inadequate one when confronting corporate power. Hawk's Nest also raises ethical questions about memory and responsibility. Who decides what gets remembered? Whose suffering is deemed historically significant? What obligations do we have to those whose stories were suppressed? The 85-year delay in erecting a memorial reflects how power shapes historical memory. The workers' stories were inconvenient, so they were forgotten. Their deaths did not fit narratives of American progress and industrial achievement, so they were omitted. Recovering these stories requires deliberate effort. It means listening to marginalized voices, searching obscure archives, and insisting that worker suffering matters as much as corporate success. It means teaching this history in schools, including it in textbooks, and ensuring that each generation learns what happened at Hawk's Nest. Finally, Hawk's Nest teaches us to ask critical questions about contemporary work. Are workers today protected? What exposures do they face? What happens when they are injured or killed? Does the legal system provide meaningful accountability? The answer is that while conditions have improved since the 1930s, workers still face significant hazards. Silicosis still occurs. Workplace deaths still happen at alarming rates. Corporate negligence still goes largely unpunished. The fundamental dynamics that produced Hawk's Nest, capitalism's drive to externalize costs and exploit labor, remain operative. Hawk's Nest is not just history. It is a warning and a reminder that worker safety requires constant vigilance, strong regulation, and the power to hold companies accountable. 764 workers died at Hawk's Nest Tunnel. 764 men who woke each morning hoping to feed their families. 764 fathers, husbands, sons, and brothers. 764 human beings whose lives were cut short by greed and negligence. Each number in that toll represents a person, a man who laughed, who loved, who dreamed of better days, a man who worked until his lungs failed, who coughed until blood flecked his lips, who gasped for air that would not come. Their names, many now lost to history, deserve to be spoken. Their suffering deserves to be acknowledged. Their deaths demand that we ask why this was allowed to happen and how we can prevent it from happening again. The companies that killed these workers are still operating, still profitable, still powerful. Union Carbide, though it has changed ownership and structure, continues as part of larger corporations. The tunnel still generates electricity. The hydroelectric plant still feeds power into the grid. There is no plague at the tunnel entrance listing the dead. There is no national day of remembrance. Most Americans have never heard of Hawk's Nest Tunnel or the men who died building it, but they should. This is American history as much as any battlefield or presidential administration. This is the story of who builds America and what they are asked to sacrifice. This is the story of whose lives are valued and whose deaths are dismissed. The workers at Hawk's Nest were not volunteers marching into known danger for a noble cause. They were desperate men, driven by poverty to accept work that killed them, lied to about the dangers they faced, and discarded when they became too sick to be profitable. They deserved better. They deserved honest information about the hazards. They deserved protective equipment and safe working conditions. They deserved medical care when they fell ill. They deserved justice when they were wronged. They received none of these things. Instead, they were used, killed, buried, and forgotten. Remembering Hawk's Nest is an act of justice, however incomplete. It insists that these lives mattered. It refuses to let corporate power dictate what is remembered and what is forgotten. It connects past struggles to present ones, showing that worker safety is always contested and must be constantly defended. As you settle into rest tonight, carry with you the memory of these 764 men. Remember that the lights you turn on, the electricity that powers your devices, the infrastructure you rely upon, all were built by workers whose labor is often invisible and whose sacrifices are rarely acknowledged. Remember that progress has costs, and those costs are not distributed equally. Remember that some people's lives are treated as expendable, while others are protected. Remember that justice delayed for 85 years is justice fundamentally denied. And remember that the only way to honor the dead is to protect the living, to demand workplace safety, to support workers' rights, to insist that no one should have to choose between feeding their family and breathing safely. Hawk's Nest Tunnel still exists, carved through Gauley Mountain, a monument built on 764 bodies. Let it also be a reminder, a warning, and a call to action. 764 lives, each one mattered. Each one should be remembered. Thank you for journeying through this painful history with me. If you found value in this story, please like, subscribe, and share. Leave a comment with your thoughts, your reflections, or your own knowledge of workplace safety struggles. Whether you're watching from the United States, from Europe, from anywhere in the world, these stories matter because workers everywhere face similar struggles. Now take a moment to breathe deeply. Feel the air fill your lungs easily, effortlessly, something the men of Hawk's Nest could not do. Let that awareness settle into gratitude and commitment. Then rest, carrying these stories forward into tomorrow. The workers of Hawk's Nest Tunnel have waited nearly a century for their story to be told fully. Tonight you have heard it. Tomorrow share it. That is how we honor the dead and protect the living. Good night.